Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we have with us Dr. Nicholas Campion. Dr. Nicholas Campion is a researcher in the history of astrology. He is the associate professor in cosmology and culture at the University of Wales Trinity St. David. He is also the director of the Sophia Center for the Study of Cosmology and Culture, and he's also the the program director for the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. And is also the editor of the peer-reviewed journal Culture and Cosmos. So welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Could you please just give us an idea of what is your research in history of astrology and in astrology in general? So just for the viewers to have an idea, please.
My concern as a historian is how we came to be where we are now. So the moment anything that happened in the past is conscious or in the record, it influences how we are now, today. So my interest in the history of astrology is extends over the whole history. So I'm not a primary researcher in many areas, but I keep a general interest in the scholarship in every area of the history of astrology and in cultures apart from the West. So the West is my own culture. I try to keep up with research in China, India, and any other area. My primary research is into contemporary astrology and its status in the modern world. But the debates which surround astrology's contemporary status and the ways in which astrologers learn and think are deeply rooted in continuous debates and ideas which go back over 2,500 years. So I keep up with research in the Renaissance, the Hellenistic period, and so on. But my core interest is how such ideas are interpreted, debated, and used today.
Okay. So you that is something that we have been talking about with several of our other guests, which is the history of astrology, of course, logically extends to the present day, as astrology has never really disappeared from our cultural background. We are more centered in the history of science, so we are working in periods from the 17th century backwards, so more older than the 17th century. So how do you, as an historian of a contemporary practice and a contemporary culture, how do you approach it methodologically? Because the methodology, I'm just doing here a comparison between the methodology of something which is historical, let's say medieval or ancient, or something which is contemporary. What are your primary methodologies? Do you do interviews? Do you use sociological work? What's the processes that you've been using?
Let me just give you a little bit of context from my personal background. When I was applying to return to academia to work for my PhD, which is now almost 25 years ago, I was asking to look at the recent history of astrology and really to do oral history. But the university, which was going to accept me into the history department, eventually rejected me. They referred me to sociology. The sociologist said I was too historical. So I then found a home in Bath Spa University, where they had a very good study of religions department, focusing on alternative spiritualities and New Age thought, and so modern astrology fits very well into such an area. So I added to my speciality as a historian a speciality in the study of religions. And in the study of religions, it's fundamental that everything exists in the present. Okay, so we might have an astrological ceiling in a Italian Renaissance building, or a horoscope from the Hellenistic world. These things actually exist in the present, and people respond to them in the present. And so that added a lot to my work as a historian, in terms of the understanding that even if we study the history of science in the 14th century, we're studying it as people in the 21st century. Our intellectual framework is drawn from the 21st century, and whatever we uncover, whatever conclusions we reach, will be read by people in the 21st century. So I moved right away from thinking of history as a linear development stretching back into the past, and became much more aware of it as constantly present in the the day-to-day present.
Yes.
So my personal methodologies when I was doing my PhD were qualitative research, interviews and questionnaires. So in anthropological terms, I was conducting an ethnography, a contemporary ethnography. I still think that as a historian, I was doing oral history. I was talking to people who are alive now about their ideas and their experiences. But I was in a study religions department, so we called it ethnography and qualitative research. So for that, I conducted about 50 in-depth unstructured interviews, mainly with practicing astrologers, and I distributed probably about 1,000 questionnaires, mainly at astrology conferences. This was before the time when we could do online questionnaires, to gather material. And my main interest was in how astrologers, people within the astrology community, respond to outside statements that astrology may be a religion, a science, or a quasi-religion, or a pseudoscience. So I was looking very much how they, as insiders, responded to such external notions, because obviously most of the public commentary on astrology, both as it is now and often by implication as it was in earlier periods, comes from people who are non-specialists, journalists, cultural critics, and so on. And they will generally define astrology as either religion, or if they're being very, very negative, quasi-religion, or science, or if they're being very negative, a pseudoscience. So, as an academic who'd adopted the study of religions as a method, I felt it was very important to allow practitioners to speak for themselves. So that was fundamentally what I found myself doing quite unexpectedly, as a result of first being rejected by history and sociology.
Yes. Well,
that was a very good outcome from this rejection. That was a good rejection.
Yes.
And when you interview these contemporary practitioners, do you find some kind of uniformity in practices and ideas, or do you find many diversity?
Quite a diversity, particularly in terms of how astrologers work with clients. So, for example, there are some astrologers who accept very strongly the importance of a quite rule-bound technical analysis of a horoscope. And there are others for whom the technical rules of the horoscope are less important than the interpretation of it and the engagement with the client. So you see those kind of modern debates as deeply rooted in ideas going back to classical times. So I would see the astrologers who follow today a more technical, rule-oriented approach to the horoscope as maybe being sort of ultimately rooted in the technical texts which we know existed in the medieval period or in the Hellenistic period, Ptolemy, Vettius Valens, and so on in the Hellenistic period. Whereas those who see the horoscope as more a means of extracting meaning and providing meaning to the client, I see as very much following in that the critical Neoplatonic point of view, rooted in Plato, but also as expressed by philosophers like Plotinus, in which it's accepted that the sky, the stars, the planets contain meaning, but the attempt to extract precise detail for people's lives from a horoscope is ultimately doomed. And both those ideas, for me, it seems, are rooted in Plato, because I think you can read Plato either through his very mathematical conception of the universe as moving towards a view of the universe in which everything can be mathematically analyzed, or through his skepticism, for example, in the metaphor for the cave, where ultimately we cannot achieve ultimate knowledge, as requiring uncertainty. So I see very much Plato as the foundation for the major ways in which modern astrologers in the West still work when they're dealing with clients.
So all these apparently different ideas coexisting today in modern practice. Have you found people who can, because as you know, philosophically speaking, we can somehow marry these two tendencies. Have you found people who were able to do it, to join this to the more strictly bounded by rules and the more Neoplatonic, so to say?
And before you answer, let me just make a comment. My current research has been focused on 16th and 17th century, where you already find the difference between a very technical, mathematically focused astrology, and then you have also the more allegorical interpretation of symbols. And what I've observed, curiously, at that time is that usually you find the two
exactly
combined in the same person. So you see people with a very strict mathematical approach, perhaps in terms of calculation and in terms of determining the factors, and then the interpretation will include on top of that precision a
layer
of symbolism, allegory that then can extend to more philosophical grounds, more religious grounds, depending on who's writing.
That was why I was asking, because also Louise's studies more the techniques of early modern period, and I'm focusing on the medieval period, which I love, but we all need to have this diachronic notion. We have to all need to understand that all this exists in a flux of time. So this is why I was also asking, because you find this in the early modern and modern period, and I found some seeds of this notion in the medieval period, I would say. here and there, you know. So this is why I was asking you if you can find people today who are able to marry, to mix, combine the two tendencies.
Oh, most people. I mean, I think these different ideas between, you know, technical precision and symbolic meaning exist on a spectrum. And you've maybe got a very few people at either end of the spectrum, and most sit in the middle. So let me give you an example from modern thought and astrology. This is from which was what was one of the main teaching schools in English speaking world astrology from the 1940s onwards till the present day, the Faculty of Astrological Studies. And now there are many teaching schools, but for a while in the English speaking world, it was almost the main school. So the student would be taught to calculate a horoscope very exactly using this, before calculators and computers, using logarithmic scales, and you know, taught that if two planets are within 4 degrees of orb of a 60-degree separation in you know, zodiacal longitude, they're in a sextile, but if they're more than 4 degrees outside of that, they're not. So you get that precision. But then most of the analysis was the faculty taught was based on character analysis, and so the student would be taught that you know, somebody with the, you know, the sun in Taurus, but the I don't know, the moon in Pisces might be you know, essentially somebody who loves stability, but in their family life and their home life may be a little bit more fluid. So, you know, we understand the symbolism for that. So they're straight away moving into a character description, which at the same time is quite precise. Like, you do like stability, your home life will be quite fluid. But that certainty is then phrased in an uncertain language. And then when they move into prediction, the term for prediction would be the analysis of future trends. And so a trend could be seen in the future. So, you know, a Mars-Saturn conjunction, which in most astrology indicates, say, you know, a sudden crisis, maybe a full stop. You know, Mars collides with Saturn. The student would be taught to say to the client, well, you may, when this aspect happens, experience a sense that of frustration, you can't quite achieve what you want. And then in would come some sense that the future can be controlled. And so the client would be told to maybe, you know, accept limitation for a while, but work around such limitations, be disciplined. In other words, you know, be Saturnine, and work Mars through these limitations, maybe acquiring a new skill, maybe making sure that your life is organized on firm foundations. And so, you know, there's a clear interpretive structure that combines an underlying certainty, like this aspect will happen in the future, together with an uncertainty as to how to explain this to the client.
So, sorry, the idea that we can predict the time and quality, but not the effect itself.
Yes.
This would lead me to another question. As an historian, I'm sure you know that normally contemporary people talk about historical astrology, pre-modern astrology, as being overly deterministic, overly fatalistic. And as you know, as an historian, it's not like that. There are several ways of thinking of it. So if you look at the sources, namely Ptolemy and Masahala, well, all the sources, How do you think? What is your idea about the concept of determinism? I was avoiding the word evolve because I was asking, how do you think the concept evolves? But evolving means that it's getting better. It's not necessarily that. How do you think it develops throughout time, this concept of determinism?
Well,
from the sources to contemporary?
I mean, to start with, to address the point you made that a lot of modern astrologers and other commentators will say that medieval astrology was more deterministic. I think that they are, well, they're obviously misreading the older texts, but I think they're also hanging on to the Enlightenment critique of astrology, which labeled astrology as deterministic. And that critique was picked up by theosophical astrologers themselves. So Alan Leo and the other early theosophical astrologers adopted this perspective, and so did early psychological astrologers. They were bringing in the idea of spiritual evolution in their views, which countered a more fatalistic, deterministic astrology. So my view, again, is that the fundamental debates were set out by not just Plato, but Aristotle and the Stoics. And so again, we get a spectrum between a sort of strict Stoic position in which the circumstances of life are absolutely beyond control and all one can do is have an internal reaction to them. And then we have Aristotle, who's more of a complicated case, because Aristotle's own writings do suggest that the human psyche is subject to nature, and so one's ability to control one's future is limited by one's natural state. And then, of course, later Aristotelianism, particularly, I think following Alexander of Aphrodisias, and then with people like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, clearly argues that the soul is completely free of direct physical planetary influence and subject only to God. And then I think the Platonic legacy can be read either as quite deterministic or it can see the psyche as also free from planetary influence. So and those trends, those schools of thought existed right through the history of astrology. One might have been more dominant at a particular period. So from the 12th century to the 15th century, obviously Aristotle was very dominant, but Christian Aristotelianism, I think, like Islamic Aristotelianism, allowed for an absolute freedom of the psyche, so long as you were a devout, religious, God-fearing person who was able to resist planetary influences. We still get that language of planetary influences in modern astrology, even though I don't think modern astrologers are usually aware of the legacy. So yes, I think that one problem with texts on how to read horoscopes is that they are written deterministically. And I think sometimes they perhaps were intended to be deterministic, but the problem is that often, the writers would be themselves writing a text that sounds deterministic, but assuming that a wider worldview is understood. So, there's the wonderful example with Ptolemy, where you can take the Tetrabiblos as being very deterministic. Ptolemy sets out precise rules. And then in Book 1, he states that if we were unable to change the future, astrology would have no role in medical diagnosis, and therefore we must be able to change the future. Otherwise, there's no point in going to an astrologer. So, that one passage subverts any idea that he was writing deterministically. And then, of course, we have the Chendilogium of the Pseudo-Ptolemaic work, which continues this idea. So every Islamic and medieval astrologer would be reading these words and taking them as their foundation. Astrology has to change the future.
Yes, and there's an evident distinction between a theoretical text and then the practice, which sometimes we see it very clear. When we have examples of practice, unfortunately, they're not as common as texts or as theoretical texts, but you do see they adjusting the interpretation,
the extreme interpretation,
interpretation towards a human situation or something that can be somehow changed, managed in some sort of way.
I always call it the prophylactic approach, because they would say, be careful of this. You can, this can happen, therefore you can avoid it or at least diminish by doing this such and such thing. And we find this in medieval. Unfortunately, as we said, we have very few examples of practice. One of them I was fortunate enough to find in my, it was actually the manuscript I studied in my PhD. 2 manuscripts of the same author, and he has 3 examples. It's precious, and we can see the doctrine, because the manuscript includes doctrine and then the practice, and then we can see how he deals with it. So maybe what we need is more examples. As historians, we all need more examples of practice, because we already have the doctrine.
Yeah. Yes, we do. There's one wonderful example of practice that I love. It's from late in the pre-modern period. It's the English natural philosopher Elias Ashmole, who you know of, and he was the patron to famous astrologers like William Lilly, very close to the king. He conducted a couple of alchemical experiments, and he sets out the time at which the experiments were conducted very closely. 2 experiments conducted very close together, and in one there's a very close relationship between Mars and Mercury, and so he says the hot metal jumped and burnt my fingers. so there's this wonderful, very exact relationship between the planetary symbolism and what actually happens in the alchemical experiment down to a very detailed level. But then, of course, Ashmole, at the same time, he's well versed in Hermetic writings, Platonic writings, scholastic writings, and he's a Christian. So he knows that above all, the soul is responsible to God, and his soul can direct these activities. So, it's almost like at a physical level, the metal jumps and burns his fingers exactly with the Mars-Mercury aspect, but he himself is an autonomous person negotiating with the physical level.
Yes. That's what we need, these kind of examples. Sometimes small examples, and it's enough if you understand the rules to see how they were putting the rules in practice. There is another thing, and I would like to return to something you said earlier in the beginning about other types of astrology. Because we as historians, we look astrology throughout time, but also in space, throughout geography, throughout other cultures. And we tend in the West to talk about Western astrology and then the other kinds of astrology. But what we have being aware of, we have been made aware of, is that they are all connected in several ways. So I would like to, because you mentioned this, I would like to see what is your views on the so-called other forms of astrology.
Yes, we talk about other forms of astrology, and I used to as well. I'm gradually trying to force myself out of my, Western identity and think, well, to, an Aztec in the 1500s, the Spanish were bringing a different kind of astrology. So, but there are connections. Yes, there's the obviously reasonably close connections between astrology in India and astrology further west. And then we know that China too had long distance connections with Indian and Persian astrology, which themselves connected up to Europe. There's one very nice example to show the interaction of such astrology, which is, I think, in the horoscope for the foundation of Baghdad, which we know was, chosen by a committee of astrologers. And generally the horoscope is very fortunate. Jupiter rising in Sagittarius, trine the sun in Leo.
It was actually by late July, I think, because the sun has just entered Leo. So it's we are close to the anniversary.
Yes, we are. Yes. So very positive, but with Mars in setting, I think in Gemini, opposed to Jupiter, and so that Mars is fatal. If you look up, in any Hellenistic text, difficult Mars aspects, it's terrible. And no astrologer could have chosen a chart with Mars in such a position, even if Jupiter and the Sun were so beautifully placed. But the solution is found in the Indian texts. And I'm speaking from memory here, but Mars, in the position it is in the Baghdad chart, is no longer malefic in Indian astrology. In fact, I'm speaking from memory here again as well, but it can be benefic. And so, we know that there was at least one Indian astrologer on the committee of astrologers who chose the chart for the foundation of Baghdad. So while for people like Mashallah, Mars would have been, if they were using Hellenistic texts, Mars would have been profoundly unfortunate. For the Indian astrologer on the panel, this would not have been a problem. And so the foundation chart for Baghdad, in my opinion, is a beautiful example of a syncretism between astrology, which had an origin in Hellenistic texts, and Indian astrology, which had in 500 or 600 years developed certain different rules than it had inherited from Hellenistic astrology. So the beautiful, there again, it's a practical example of astrology from cultures which had diverged being used together.
Yes, it is.
Did they say why Mars was no longer? I'm curious, personally.
No.
They just say
in any astrological text, rules are just stated, aren't they? Usually, they're not. A reason is not given.
They are not. Yeah, they are not explained.
Yeah.
Well, it's
not explained. But again, I'm speaking from memory, but I have those details. I've published a paper on this.
Oh, I would like to read it. Yes, we will try to find it.
Well, I would like to ask you a little bit about the Sophia Center and the MA that you coordinate. How has it been the experience of teaching the topic of astrology in current day academic environment? Because it's not, as we started our conversation, it's not always a topic that fits well into either an historical, religious, or even philosophical program. Astrology has always this
hybrid. It's like an hybrid.
Yes, I mean, as we know, a lot of academics and skeptics and external commentators just get very upset at the very mention of the word astrology.
Yes.
And they would think that if it's used in a university program, you are somehow giving this dangerous practice some credibility. So when we created the MA in 2002, I was involved in two separate strands of inquiry. There was, one was the history of astrology, in which Patrick Curry, my then colleague, was very, very active and influential, and I was as well. But my another area I'd got involved in was the study of cultural astronomy, and the study of cultural astronomy it emerged out of studies of archaeoastronomy in the 1970s. So beginning with the astronomers' attempts to find astronomical symbolism in archaeological sites, notably Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids. So the term cultural astronomy was around, but it was quite limited in scope and still is. So I thought that if we created a program, it could actually look at the whole culture of astronomy and astrology. And of course, we know that the separation between the words astrology and astronomy is only a feature of the modern West. It's completely anachronistic when applied to the pre-modern period, and totally anachronistic when applied to any culture outside the West. So we created the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology, and it's actually a fact that putting the word astronomy first and it alters people's attitudes to the whole program. The third person who we created the program with was Michael York, who was actually my program director for my PhD, my lead supervisor, and his area was New Age studies and religion. And so we did develop a strong religious focus in the MA, and it's humanities based, and so there's a strong historical focus, a study of religions focus, some archaeology, a little bit of sociology, and we find that that there's a great overlap between those programs of those subject areas if we look at the official descriptors. So probably I would say the program is equal parts history and anthropology with some philosophy and some archaeology. But so we created a totally rigorous academic program, and so there's no problem with it in the wider world, and we do extremely well in the University of Wales Trinity St David.
And to add a bit also to your work, the Culture and the Cosmos journal has been, I think, one of the references for any studies of astrology from many points of view, historical and otherwise, in academia for quite some time. You do have studies into the history of astrology popping up in other journals, other peer-reviewed journals, but I think Culture and Cosmos has been
I think the main
central,
focus, yes, the main focus of these studies, and it is already like a very well-established name in this area. So it is a very good reference for people who want to study or to publish in articles in this kind of studies.
So I would ask you, how is the journal going on, and do you have plans for the future? How's the project?
Yes, right at the moment, it's slipped into being rather late. I'm still I've finished the winter spring 2019 issue, so it's a year late, but we've got material to bring it up to date. And that's partly because I'm the sole editor and I've had other big writing projects, so it's slipped a bit, but we've got the material, and that'll all be up to date very soon, I hope. We are still engaged in putting the entire back catalogue online, but found that some papers and some issues needed re-editing, so we're stalled in some where further copy edits are necessary, but I hope that very soon we'll have the entire back catalogue online, open access, and that will be up to date to the present moment.
That's wonderful.
That would be wonderful. I think only people who work with editing are the only ones who know how much work there is in it. Because people who are just reading from the outside think it's kind of easy and fast. But we know it isn't. We know it isn't. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I know it is, because you receive a paper for submission, which has maybe some very interesting ideas, but it may be badly written, references are missing, the structure is poor, it can take days to work on an essay which you think needs to be published but has problems, and that includes reviewers' time as well. Of course, reviewers give their time voluntarily, as we all do.
Yes,
and
it's a lot of time. Yes. Yeah, we know. So yes, only people who work with editing know how much work it is. But it is still worth it, because when you see the published work and when you see the final result, it's very rewarding.
Yes, and it's then the magazine, in this case Culture and Cosmos, provides a very valuable repository of a lot of research being done at various levels in the field, history of astrology, and in all areas,
fields,
all related fields. So I think it's been how shall I say, a reference.
I would say a reference.
I'm trying to find another word, but a reference in the studies. Yes. So I think we have talked about.
Yes, we have addressed several of the main topics. There would be much more to say, but I think for now, and you are obviously welcome to return if and when you want to. And we are going to say goodbye for now. And thank you very much for accepting this, being our guest in the podcast.
And we hope to have you on other occasions.
Sometimes.
So thank you, Louise. Thank you, Helena. Thank you for a really stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.